Shore point to NLO. Shore point to New Little Odessa. Come in, Odessa. Do you read? Shore point to NLO. Shore point to New Little Odessa. Come in, Odessa. Do you read? Shore point to NLO. Shore point to New Little Odessa. Come in, Odessa. Do you read? Shore point to NLO. Shore point to New Little Odessa. Come in, Odessa. Do you read?
Hello, Dr. Freeman. The car's all ready for you. Hop in and I'll lower you down to the beach.
Buggy model. The buggy's model went through many iterations before reaching its final version. We cycled through designs that satisfied both our artistic and physics simulation needs, but then hit an unexpected issue. Many playtesters, even experienced FPS players, were getting motion sick while driving it. Along with some simulation tweaks, we discovered that altering the buggy model helped. The more the model obscured the world, the worse the motion sickness became. So we began stripping away parts of the model, removing more and more of the body until players stopped feeling sick. In particular, being able to see the ground through the missing undercarriage made a noticeable difference.
The car's ready for you now, Dr. Freeman. Come back up, Dr. Freeman. The car's on the pier. The car's ready for you now, Dr. Freeman.
Buggy introduction. We wanted something more engaging for the buggy's introduction than just having the player hop in and drive away. The crane helped with that. Crucially, we needed players to learn how to recover the buggy when it flips over, and this sequence forced them into that situation. Training under pressure is always tricky. We wanted to emphasize the outline infestation as the reason to stay inside the buggy. So we kept the outline threat active and provided a couple of citizens on mounted guns for support. A small bonus, players also get the experience of being lifted by the crane just before they'll get to operate one.
Good, here we go. Magnet's failing. Hold on. Sorry, Doc.
Buggy Training Course. This training section was designed to let the player play around with their buggy. At the time Half-Life 2 was released, this level of physical simulation in the vehicle was novel, so we wanted to give players ample opportunity to experiment with it. The player has also just left the tight confines of Ravenholm, and we liked giving him the contrast and reward of being able to move quickly through a large space, feeling safe inside a vehicle. We made sure to require a turbo jump to get out of this area, which doubled as a test to make sure they'd reached a level of comfort in their driving, and also ensured that they didn't leave their buggy behind.
Buggy physics. The physics for a buggy took a lot of trial and error. We wanted it to feel fast, even though its top speed was only about 35 miles an hour, so we had to do some cheating to make it work. We added extra vertical force to the turbo jump and a bit of kick to the rear when using the handbrake to power slide. Without those, the low speed meant the buggy just wasn't fun to drive. On top of that, the world was full of unpredictable physics system-driven chaos. Players were bound to drive the buggy into all kinds of collisions, so we had to make sure that they could always get out. This took a lot of experimenting and playtesting. In the end, we settled on a pretty goofy, unrealistic simulation that made the buggy more forgiving and harder to flip. Its center of gravity is super low, and the wheels, while they look like they turn a lot, actually don't. It was our first attempt at a physically simulated vehicle, and we learned a ton from it. Thanks to that, we were able to make the muscle car in Episode 2 much easier to drive.
Transition tunnels. Building the coast required us to develop a way to handle level transitions. To move from one level to another, we need to save everything in the transition space as the player leaves the first level and restore it in the next level after loading. Critically, we also have to save and restore everything visible to the player in the transition area, even if it lies outside the space itself. For this reason, we aim to keep transition spaces as small and enclosed as possible. In most of the game, a small room works well for this purpose, but on the coast, we needed a different solution. After some experimentation, we settled on dark tunnels. Besides being reusable in a believable way, the tunnels allowed us to add a bright light flare at the end to mask the fact that we can't render what's ahead of the player, because it exists in an entirely different level.
Buggy sound engine. The audio for the buggy was challenging because we wanted it to feel like a really powerful vehicle that's driving along at super high speed, even though the maps aren't really big enough to support that, and the buggy doesn't really leave first gear, and it has a top speed of maybe 35 miles an hour. Now, in our defense, 35 miles an hour is still pretty fast, especially back in 2004. In addition to the speed, the driving inputs are really simple. So with a keyboard as your target input device, the player's controls are basically binary. So the buggy's either accelerating or not accelerating, it's turning fully in one direction or not. So essentially, we need to create all this audio complexity to represent a simulation where the complexity doesn't actually exist. So we build a fake engine for the buggy's audio. It's got its own transmission, and we combine the player's inputs with data from the physics simulation. We measure the torque on each simulated wheel, whether it's spinning or making contact, and we create a set of looping sounds and then carefully blend between them as the fake engine shifts gears in response to the wheel data. And we just basically kept trying different things. We added more complexity, we did some fine-tuning until the buggy just feels more fun and sort of rewards you for that feeling of going fast. And most players, they don't really comment on it other than saying the buggy sounds good, and to us that's the success, given the amount of craziness that was going on under the hood.
Thumpers. Whenever possible, there's a lot of value in players feeling like they've figured something out on their own. It makes the world feel more alive, rather than just a series of gameplay elements lined up for the player. If we can accept the risk that some percentage of players might miss an element entirely, we can take a more subtle approach. We took this approach with Thumpers, designing setups that players are likely to encounter but aren't forced to engage with. There are plenty of visual and audio cues, as well as inline reactions, to help the player understand what's happening. It doesn't guarantee all players will figure it out, but playtesting showed that most did.
Antlions. With the player driving the buggy throughout the coast, we needed a pervasive enemy that could justifiably appear anywhere and act as a constant threat to keep the player in or near their buggy. Antlions spawning from the sand were the perfect solution. Their high mobility allowed them to keep up with the buggy for short bursts, unlike our humanoid enemies. Plus, they were very satisfying to run over.
Coast. We wanted a wide open section of the game for the buggy, but we still needed a way to constrain the player's movement. Choosing a coastline gave us a natural boundary along one side of the map while still feeling open and expansive. It also helped visualize the effects of the Combine's extraction of Earth's resources. Playtesters still tried to swim out to sea, so we added leeches to deter them. The leeches couldn't be a real avoidable enemy the players felt they could fight, so they're a bit magical. Players generally understood that they were pushing the game's boundaries, so we didn't overdevelop them.
Buggy sound engine. The audio for the buggy was challenging because we wanted to feel like a really
Grenade House. A lot of a Half-Life game is about giving players slightly novel combat experiences around each corner, even if they're just small tweaks on previous ones. They don't all have to be skill-based challenges. Sometimes they can just be fun moments where the player gets to enjoy themselves. This Grenade House is one of those moments, with the twist being that we've inverted the usual setup. Instead of letting the player drop grenades on enemies below, we've put the enemies above. The unlimited grenade box is a somewhat clumsy way to encourage players to engage with the scenario, but its invulnerability also ensures the players can still climb up to the floor above, even if they've blown up everything else. Grenade House. A lot of a Half-Life game is about giving players slightly novel combat experiences around each corner, even if they're just small tweaks on previous ones. They don't all have to be skill-based challenges. Sometimes they can just be fun moments where the player gets to enjoy themselves. This Grenade House is one of those moments, with the twist being that we've inverted the usual setup. Instead of letting the player drop grenades on enemies below, we've put the enemies above. The unlimited grenade box is a somewhat clumsy way to encourage players to engage with the scenario, but its invulnerability also ensures the players can still climb up to the floor above, even if they've blown up everything else.
Antlion design. In some of the earliest design work for the game, we had plans for multiple core alien races, with the Combine being just one of them. One of the other races was a religious insectoid species, and antlions were part of that. Later, as we developed Coast, we started viewing them more as pests that came through the Zen portals, along with headcrabs and other creatures. While they aren't actually from Zen, they infest the corners of any world they enter, a lot like cockroaches.
Buggy sound design. The sound design for the buggy was based on samples from an old 1968 Camaro. And we chose that car because they have these amazing V8 engines with just huge pistons. And there's not really another sound like it. It has this sort of gutsy, visceral sound that we were looking for. The transmission also has this really wonderful mechanical whine when it stops accelerating. And that combination felt really responsive within this basically binary input system that we had to work with. So the fake engine transmission wasn't modeled after a real-world car. Instead, it was just designed as a simple system to reward the player for holding down the accelerator. So it's like a looping escalator that produces a rising tone, constantly building tension and shifting gears whenever the tone needs to restart. And since the player would quickly run out of space in our relatively small maps, the goal was just to make accelerating fun for a short period of time.
Buggy birds. In one memorable Coast playtest, a player returned to their vehicle after exploring a house and happened to see a bird flying past. They yelled at the bird, telling it to stay away from their buggy, complaining that birds often foul up their cars in real life. In our post-playtest discussion, we realized that this was the first time we'd had objects separate from the player that the player actually cared about. We saw it as an opportunity to explore, so we built a system to deliver the moment that playtesters feared. When the player leaves their buggy alone for a while and is out of sight, we spawn a seagull at a random location on the vehicle frame. As time goes on, the seagull spawns poop decals on the car body beneath it and continues until the player returns, at which point it flies away. Naturally, playtesters wanted to be able to clean their vehicle, so we added the ability to wash the car by driving it into shallow water. It was late enough in development that we already had the tech for all of this, so the feature was quick to implement. It's one of those cases where we know only a small percentage of players will discover it. But if we can implement these kind of details efficiently and have enough of them, most players will encounter at least one.
Open world loot. The openness of Coast introduced a new problem for us in how we distributed item rewards. In a Half-Life game, we typically reward players for exploring. If you see the way forward but notice something off to the side, there's probably something useful if you take the time to search. When we first started playtesting our Coast maps, we tucked rewards away in the corners of the outdoor areas. However, this led to a worse experience with the buggy. The wide open spaces meant there were always lots of small areas that looked like they might contain something, and players kept stopping and getting out of the buggy to search. It became tedious and interrupted the fun of the level. So, we removed those scattered rewards, but this raised a new problem. How do we tell the player when it's worth getting out of the buggy? After some thought, we established a rule. Any kind of human construction would always come with gameplay content and exploration rewards, while purely natural areas would be left empty. We couldn't tell players this directly, but it aligned well with their natural assumptions, and we reinforced it consistently with areas like this.
Boathouse. In Half-Life 1, we discovered we could get a lot of value from scenarios where different AI enemies fight each other. It's fun for players to watch them engage, and it's much easier to observe enemy behavior when you're not the one that's being threatened. This first encounter between antlions and Combine soldiers is designed to be a fun opportunity to ram something with the buggy, but it also serves to highlight the thumper. By seeing the soldiers use the thumper to hold off antlions, we hope more players would come to understand its purpose. We liked how the soldiers demonstrated the value of staying near the thumper while engaging with the antlions.
Gordon Freeman! Hurry, get in the basement. We're expecting gunships at any moment. Colonel Cubbage will be glad to see you made it.
Combine gunship. The gunship was an interesting problem. We had a helicopter flight model already and didn't really have time to build something completely new. So we tuned the helicopter's flight model until it felt different enough, and then derived the gunship's organic animation state from the values coming out of that simulation. We also tried to keep it as truthful as possible. For example, there's a limit as how much it can turn its head to aim its cannon, and if it needs to aim beyond that, it has to alter its flight path to bring the cannon around to bear. It's not allowed to just cheat. The other key feature was its engine sound. We have sound spatialization, so the player can tell roughly where it is, but the gunship is a fast-moving object and it's up in the air, away from any nearby reference points. As a result, it can be hard to tell exactly how far away it is and how fast it's moving. To fix that, we added a Doppler effect to the engine sound, pitch shifting it based on the gunship's velocity relative to you. It's a subtle effect, but it's extremely effective at subconsciously helping you perceive the gunship's location and direction, critical information letting you know that you're being hunted by it.
Laser-guided RPG. The laser guidance feature of the RPG was a huge headache for us because it was difficult to teach. Many playtesters would fire the RPG and then immediately duck behind cover, which meant they didn't see the rocket's flight path. Even worse, they didn't realize the rocket was now turning around to fly back at them. We tried various HUD elements and laser dot indicators to help, but found that most players overlooked them, focusing on the enemy instead. We made as many small improvements as we could, like emphasizing the feature in Odessa's speech and enhancing the audio and visuals around how the gunship shoots down direct RPG shots. While these changes helped some players grasp the feature, we never reached a point where we felt confident that almost everyone understood it. We even considered cutting the feature entirely, but gunship combat without it was much less interesting. The laser guidance forced the player to keep the gunship in sight while the rocket was in flight, but that also meant the gunship had line of sight back, creating a tension we loved.
Odessa Cubbage. Odessa Cubbage is an example of the kind of cameo character we found works well. He's an entertaining guy with some entertaining details, living inside his own little bubble. Since he doesn't leave his scenario, he's free to be exaggerated enough to stand out. We started with his model, which was repurposed from a cut section of the game, and named him after the title of a spam email we received. The model was originally a Norwegian fisherman, and it didn't quite fit as an Englishman, so we slapped a mustache on him, and in that moment, Odessa's character was born. He's ultimately a charlatan, with everything about him being fake. His accent, his mustache, everything. He would never put himself in danger, making him the perfect person to hand Gordon the RPG and explain exactly how to use it.
Flying vehicle audio. The large flying enemies in the game present a unique audio challenge. During combat, they're much more mobile than other enemies, and they often move a significant distance away from the player. They're also really dangerous if they have line of sight. So these factors led us to focus on an audio solution specifically around occlusion. In other words, when you can see the enemy and when the enemy can see you. And we wanted to make a clear audio distinction between when they have that line of sight. So the flying vehicle engine sounds are made up of multiple looping sounds that we play simultaneously. And some of those loops are processed by the DSP system based on the space you're in, while others are played directly and unprocessed. So the DSP system adds more of an environment echoing effect when we run sound through that system. So when the flying object is occluded behind something, it can't see you, we increase the percentage of loops that go through the DSP processing, and it sounds like that object is a little more distant. And then when that enemy emerges from behind an object and it can see you, we play more of the direct sound. So that overall just gives you a sense that the sound is either distant and directionless or more directly in your line of sight. And you can sort of hear it when a helicopter emerges from behind a building. Ideally, you can really hear that difference.
Get your car, and I'll open up this gate. Drive safely.
D2 Coast 04. This map was actually the first area of coast that we built, before the crane and other elements existed. The drained seabed and rusted ships were some of the earliest pieces of art direction we developed. Years later, we showcased the map in our 2003 E3 demonstration, though much of the gameplay was still being figured out at the time. As a result, when we began building out the entire coast section, that demonstration became a useful vision for us to work toward.
Audio over distance. The large-scale spaces in the coast maps led us to seek an audio solution for how sound changes over distance. So for instance, in these maps, an enemy can be well over 100 yards away, and their gun should sound different at that range than when it's up close. We decided to store our sounds in a single stereo file with the near sound in the left channel and the far sound in the right channel. And then during playback, we crossfade, or we change the proportion of sound you hear between those two channels based on the player's distance from the sound. And it was a simple system that worked well. It helped us with memory constraints. You can easily hear it in action. Just listen to how a Combine soldier's gunshots change as you drive towards them.
We wanted the buggy to be more than just a means of travel, so we decided to attach a gun to it. We chose the Tower Cannon, a Half-Life 1 weapon we liked but hadn't found a place for it in Half-Life 2. The Tower Cannon can shoot through walls, which makes it tricky for level design, so we limited it to the coast section. Once you introduce wall-penetrating weapons, level design becomes much tougher. Furthermore, we mounted an ammunition crate on the back of the buggy, giving the player unlimited SMG ammo throughout coast. This was especially helpful for playtesters who struggled with the infinite antlions spawning from the sand.
Crane. The crane took a lot of fine-tuning to get right. Something that needed to generate so much physical force was always risky, given the limitations of our rigid body physics and destruction technology. For example, the magnet was never going to fully meet player expectations for something with that much mass. But because the crane was stationary, we could carefully choose everything within its range and fine-tune as needed. Fortunately, most players didn't seem to notice its rougher edges, likely because of the sheer novelty of interacting with something like it in a vaguely realistic physics environment.
ramming with the buggy. Our physics system is based on rigid bodies, which means it doesn't support any deformation or destruction of objects. If a physical object is hit by something, it can move if allowed, but otherwise nothing happens. So, when you drive the buggy through a glass window, we have to employ some trickery to make things work as expected. Because the window is fixed in place, the physics simulation will actually bounce the buggy off the window. But it does notify our game system that a collision occurred. The game system handles destruction, so it breaks the window into glass shards and tells the physics system to start simulating them. Crucially, the game system also tells the physics system to restore the buggy's state to where it was before the collision. This ensures that the next time physics is simulating, the buggy will drive freely through the now destroyed window. This process does produce a one-frame hitch in the buggy's physics, as it briefly stops and is teleported back to the instant before the impact. We're sorry if knowing this has made Half-Life 2 totally unplayable, but after watching playtests at the time, we decided we actually liked the momentary hitch. It added to the sense of impact.
Opportunistic moments. Some memorable moments in the game come from the interactions of multiple game systems, but sometimes we realize these moments are likely to happen only rarely. When that's the case, we often wish more players would experience them. There's a tension here. The more we know players will encounter something, the more effort we can put into it. But if it feels too artificial, the moment can come across as forced, and players may not respond as positively. The gunship cinematic death is an example where we nudge things a bit, trying to increase the chances of a memorable moment without being too obvious. The design of this area and the gunship's flight path make it likely that the player and the gunship are in the right spots when it dies. If they are, we trigger the gunship's crash into the cars. If not, it dies in the usual way. It's totally gamey, but playtesters didn't seem to mind when the moment played out well.
Roller mines. Roller mines were created to fill the need for an enemy that could threaten players while driving the buggy. Since the player in the buggy was essentially a fully physically simulated entity, we thought it would be interesting to also have a physically simulated enemy. The manhack had already shown us how this approach could lead to an enemy with lots of interesting interactions with the world. So we built the roller mine, a ball whose movement is entirely driven by generating torque on itself, and iterated on its behavior until it was fun to drive against. Roller mines aren't particularly dangerous to the buggy, but if you let them stack up, they can become a problem, especially near a cliffside. We also made sure they worked well when the player's on foot, allowing level designers to get a few extra encounters out of them.
Ambush. One of the general challenges of a Half-Life style FPS is that the player is constantly moving forward into spaces they don't know. This means that when they find themselves in combat, they're in unfamiliar areas with no knowledge of how to approach the fight. We use many different methods to help the player with this problem, and this ambush is one example. Upon arrival, the player fights a group of Combine among these houses. During the fight and the exploration afterward, the player has the chance to learn the arena layout. Then, when the player explores up into this attic, we spawn a second wave of Combine. In that second fight, the player now has the advantage of knowing the layout, allowing them to make more tactical decisions in defending against the ambushers.
Crossbow. This is the player's first opportunity to get the crossbow in the game, and looking back, it's somewhat surprising we didn't gate it. It's entirely possible for the player to drive right past it. To make that less likely, we set up the roadblock and vantage point to encourage players to get out of the buggy, at which point they'd spot the crossbow and item crate. Playtesting showed that almost every player stopped and collected the weapon, but this is a case where the difference between playtesting and real play might matter. A playtester who's been playing since the start of Coast may not be as fatigued with exploration as someone who's been playing from the very beginning of the game. So, we placed another crossbow a few levels ahead, directly on the player's path in Nova Prospect.
Gas station. We had grand plans for this encounter. We envisioned building a gas station that the player would fight around, likely igniting the gas tanks and setting fire to everything. We imagined the player driving away from a raging fire, but budget and performance were harsh constraints in 2003, and the station had to keep getting smaller and simpler to fit into Coast's large levels. Our plans for a dynamic fire system didn't materialize, and building it no longer made sense. There's always a limit to how much work we can justify for a single encounter. In the end, the only remnants of our original vision are the explosive gas tanks.
Area portals. One performance challenge we faced in Coast was handling wide open spaces that included buildings with highly detailed interiors, or at least they were detailed by 2003 standards. When the player was outside, we wanted to allocate as much of our budget as possible to rendering that space, without losing resources to the building interiors. But unless we were willing to board up every window and door, the player could still see inside. To solve this, we created a feature called area portals, placing one in every open window and door. An area portal precomputes a flat image of the building's interior, and during play, when the player is some distance away, the area portal displays this precomputed image over the window or door, allowing us to skip rendering the actual interior. As the player approaches, we smoothly crossfade between the area portal's image and the building's actual contents. With careful use, area portals helped us to meet our performance goals on Coast, along with the occasional door that closed itself behind you.
Occlusion. In Half-Life 1 and much of Half-Life 2, the world consisted mainly of enclosed tunnels and corridors, which worked well with a binary space partition, or BSP tree. Essentially, this tech allowed us to quickly sort through the geometry and determine what might be visible in the player's view. But the open areas in Coast and other outdoor sections didn't suit that approach, so we needed some new tech. Area portals were one, allowing us to carve out the world into discrete chunks separated by portals. Doors and windows, that is, not aperture science ones. We also developed an additional occlusion system, which basically said that if the player can't see through, over, or around a large object, don't render what's on the other side. This might seem an obvious thing not to do, but it takes some work to make sure that calculating what's on the other side of the big thing isn't slower than just rendering everything. So to make that calculation fast, level designers placed large occlusion volumes inside major terrain shapes and big occluding objects like buildings, and during rendering, we could then test the bounds of entities against these volumes to avoid rendering anything the player couldn't see. Detail objects. Once we had outdoor sections running, it was clear they needed some form of high-frequency detail, so we added small foliage elements, like grass and shrubs, across the displacement terrain. But we knew we couldn't afford, which is to say we didn't have the time, to hand-place them all. So we built the detail object system, which generates small foliage elements automatically based on the displacement material. Each material specifies the type of foliage to place, along with a set of parameters. At map compile time, the system calculates random points on the surface and selects foliage to place there. Given performance constraints, there was still a fairly complex hand-authoring process for foliage texture sheets, allowing us to render all of them in a single pass.
Terrain and performance. Our performance budget was often a significant constraint when it came to combat, and even more so for combat on terrain surfaces. When NPCs move, they perform many small spatial probes to determine if they can safely navigate their chosen path. To help visualize it, imagine they can't see and are constantly waving a stick in front of themselves to check if the way is clear. The performance cost of these probes increases with the complexity of the world geometry. Our terrain displacement system creates uneven surfaces using many polygons, far more than the perfectly flat floors found elsewhere. This meant that NPCs moving on coast terrain were more resource-intensive than in other areas, and that constraint dictated the scale of many encounters in this section of the game.
The bridge. This bridge section was inspired by the Deception Pass Bridge, just up the road from Valve's office. We initially built this section as a pure navigation puzzle, gradually layering more gameplay into it. It also became the primary test case for our players' edge friction. In our movement system, we subtly increase friction on the player's deceleration as they approach the edge of a surface. Players have never noticed it, likely because it aligns naturally with their goal of stopping at the edge to look down, matching human tendency to move more slowly and carefully near a drop. But it's a critical feature for this part of the game. We know this because at one point during development, we accidentally broke it, and suddenly all of our playtesters started repeatedly falling to their deaths.
Bridge playtesting. The bridge section was always a high point in playtests, with testers consistently having strong reactions to it. The tension they felt while slowly making their way over the girders was visible in their movements. Over time, we layered more challenges into the traversal, and playtests only became more entertaining to watch. From the train rumbling across the bridge and shaking the player, to a surprise head crab in a shack that seemed like a safe haven midway through, we did feel a little guilty relishing the playtesters' visible stress, but we weren't total monsters. After players made it across the bridge, they'd breathe a sigh of relief, disable the Combine shield, and then realize they had to return across the underside. Concerned they might be bored on the second trip, we decided to add a gunship to keep them company out on the girders.
Bridge gunship. We were particularly happy with the gunship fight, despite it being tricky to set up given the level geometry. Being on the underside of the bridge allowed the gunship to move fully around the player, using all 3 dimensions to position itself above and below at different moments. The girders provide plenty of high-frequency cover, creating opportunities for the gunship fire to produce a fun and dynamic visual and audio display.
Fracture detected. Automatic medical systems engaged. Morphine administered.